Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining the IIB for the 5th session of our COVID-19 webinar series, presented in partnership with our valued associate professional members. Today, we're very pleased to have our gold member partners, Clifford Chance, lead a discussion on data privacy through a COVID-19 lens. As if data privacy and information security were not challenging enough with the varying international, federal, and state law requirements, coping with COVID has added a new level of complexity, both increased cyber risks as well as remote work complications. Guiding us through our discussion today are Megan Gordon, Phil Angeloff, and Brian Yin. Megan is a partner of the firm's Global Data Risk Team, and in addition to advising clients on privacy and data protection laws and regulations, her practice covers AML and sanctions. We are lucky indeed to have such expertise available to us. As a reminder, all participants are muted, but we encourage you to submit questions through the Q&A function on Zoom, or you can email them to us at info@iib.org throughout the session. As per our usual practice, following today's webinar, we will email all of you the slides and a link to the recorded session, which will be available on our YouTube channel, in the members only section of our website, and Zoom on demand. Thank you all for your time with us today. Megan, I'll virtually hand the mic over to you.
Thank you so much. And we're happy to be here today with everyone to talk about privacy and data security. And here we are on Zoom, which is, of course, had its own privacy issues in the past. But we just want to jump right in. I want to introduce my colleague, Phil Angeloff, who's a counsel and one of our data privacy specialists in our bank regulatory practice, as well as Brian Yin, who's one of our lead attorneys working in the U.S. Data Privacy and Security Group. So just to get started, we have a quick poll to talk to you about. And as you'll see, we just want to get a general idea of how familiar everybody is with privacy and cybersecurity laws. Be not very familiar, some familiarity, very familiar, or whether we have some experts in our group here. So if you can click on the individual buttons, and we will get the results pretty quickly here in about 30 seconds, I believe. All right, so everybody, looks like we have pretty good familiarity with data privacy laws. We've got, split between 40 and 40 with familiarity and a lot of familiarity, and then we've got 20% of experts here in the group. So we will keep that in mind as we go through. And going to the next slide, we have one more polling question for everybody. Given the current pandemic, how important is has your firm prioritized privacy or cybersecurity? Is it less of a priority, equal priority, or it's business as usual, or has it become more of a priority for you? All right, just get the results here in a few seconds. So we have 64% that say that it's become more of a priority, none that it's become less of a priority. And I would say that so there was a recent poll by the International Association of Privacy Professionals, and that poll said that 58% of respondents said that it's just as much of a priority, if not more of a priority. And it seems like this group, it's even higher than that. So that's just kind of interesting given where some of the other industries are. So move on to the next slide. Yeah, just to give a little bit of an intro of where we are currently, we really are, from a privacy perspective, in a period of unprecedented risk during COVID-19. And this is just one figure, but it shows that 33%, there's been a 33% increase in phishing attacks against financial services firms in Q1 of 2020, and it keeps going up from there. And really, this is an unusual time where people are working from home, where we have remote working conditions, onboarding and offboarding of employees during remote working. So really an unprecedented time period for privacy and data security issues. Next slide. Today, we're going to go through first the legal framework, and my colleague Phil is going to kick that off. Then Brian's going to talk to you about some COVID-19 threats. We're going to talk to you about responding to compromise and also some prevention and key takeaways. So with that, take it away, Phil.
Okay, thanks, Megan, and hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this webinar. We thought it would be good to provide you with a brief overview of the key privacy and data protection laws and rules at the federal level and in New York, where most of the IIB members operate. So I'll start with an overview of relevant privacy and data protection rules and guidance at the federal and New York state level, and then we'll turn it over to Brian to talk about privacy under the California Consumer Protection Act. So first, the principal federal privacy and data security statute is the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, as I'm sure most of you know, or the GLBA. The privacy provisions of the GLBA generally protect non-public personal information collected from consumers in connection with a financial product or service. And the GLBA contains a so-called privacy rule and a so-called safeguards rule. The privacy rule generally limits disclosure of non-public personal information to unaffiliated third parties. The safeguards rule is generally intended to ensure the confidentiality, security, and proper disposal of customer information. Before getting into a bit more detail on these rules, it's important to briefly discuss who is covered by the privacy provisions of the GLBA and who are the responsible regulatory agencies. As a general matter, the GLBA applies to financial institutions, which would include U.S. branches and agencies of non-U.S. banks, as well as their U.S. affiliates engaged in financial activities such as, for example, U.S. broker-dealer affiliates, swap dealer, future commission merchant affiliates, etc. Rulemaking authority for the implementation of the GLBA is vested with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, as well as the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, with respect to entities under their jurisdiction. The Federal Trade Commission also has GLBA rulemaking and oversight authority with respect to financial entities that are not under the jurisdiction of another functional regulator. The authority to supervise and enforce the GLBA is also split among several agencies, including the federal banking regulators, the SEC, the CFTC, as well as the CFPB, which is responsible for large insured depository institutions with more than 10 billion in assets. Generally, the GLBA privacy requirements apply only to non-public personal information about consumers, that is, individuals who obtain financial products or services primarily for personal, family, or household purposes. The GLBA generally does not apply to information about customers that are legal entities, and also generally does not apply to individuals who obtain products or services for business or commercial purposes. But in practice, it may be difficult to assess whether an individual customer is using a product or service for business or for personal, family, or household purpose. Also, while most agencies and branches of non-U.S. banks in the U.S. are wholesale branches or agencies, there may be instances where the GLBA provisions would be relevant, as some services are still provided to individuals who are consumers. And also the GLBA provisions would be relevant to the extent U.S. broker-dealers or other non-bank affiliates in the U.S. provide services to consumers. So the GLBA privacy rule generally prohibits the sharing of non-public personal information about consumers with an affiliate third parties, unless the consumer is provided with a notice and an opportunity to opt out, Consumers must be provided with an initial and annual notice of the institution's privacy policies and practices with respect to collecting and disclosing non-public personal information to both affiliate and non-affiliated third parties. Also, the notice must provide a consumer with a reasonable opportunity to opt out from the sharing of non-public personal information other than is permitted by the exemptions under the statute. The safeguards rule requires the responsible agencies to establish appropriate standards for the financial institutions subject to their jurisdiction relating to administrative, technical, and physical safeguards to ensure the security and confidentiality of customer records and information, and to protect against unauthorized access of such records or information. To implement the safeguards rule, the federal banking agencies have promulgated interagency guidelines establishing information security standards. These guidelines apply to customer information maintained by branches or agencies of foreign banks, among other financial institutions. And for purposes of the guidelines, customer is a consumer, again, with whom the financial institution has a customer relationship. The guidelines require implementation of a written information security program that includes administrative, technical, and physical safeguards. This program, this customer security program, must be based on a risk assessment which takes into account what customer information the institution has, where it's stored, as well as the size and complexity of the institution and the nature and scope of its activities. So as the COVID-19 crisis has changed the manner in which customer information is collected and stored, it would be prudent to reassess the relevant risks in order to ensure that the information security program has the right controls in place to protect that information. This includes assessing the adequacy of IT controls such as passwords, multi-factor authentication, and other data access rules, as well as the adequacy of physical controls to data information access. So with respect to physical controls, for example, employees working from home should be instructed regarding the protection of customer information, which they may have in a physical form. Controls also include monitoring system to detect unauthorized access and incident response programs to direct actions when a data breach is suspected or detected. And these controls should also be reevaluated in the context of the work from home environment. It's important to know that while the guidelines establishing standards for safeguarding customer information apply by their terms to information about consumers, the guidelines clearly state that they do not in any way limit the authority of the banking regulators to address unsafe or unsound practice. So this begs the question whether the lack of an information security program that covers customers more broadly rather than just consumers could be deemed to be unsafe or unsound practice. So in that regard, it's an open question how the COVID environment has impacted what may be considered to be an unsafe or unsound practice as it relates to safeguarding customer information, and how an institution's information security program should be adjusted to take that into account. As part of the FFIC's IT examination handbook, the federal banking regulators have published an information security booklet, as I'm sure many of you know, which contains very detailed guidance concerning the expectations of the federal banking regulators for an information security program. The GLBA is only one of the sources underpinning the IT handbook. Importantly, another one is the interagency guidelines establishing standards for safety and soundness, which provide, among other things, that an institution should have internal controls and information systems that are appropriate to the size of the institution and the nature and scope of its activities. So in light of the magnified data security and data privacy risks during the current environment, now is more important than ever for institutions to assess their risks and apply the guidance provided by the FFIC IT handbook. For example, the handbook has a chapter on the use of remote devices, both institution-owned and employee-owned. Personal devices are commonly referred as BYOD devices. I'm sure you know. The IT handbook specifically indicates that for personally owned devices, the institution may not have the ability to configure the devices, and therefore management should have an effective method or solution to ensure that such devices meet defined institution security standards, such as operating system version, patch levels, and anti-malware solutions before such devices are allowed to log onto the network. So for institutions that do not follow this guidance provided by the banking regulator, there is at least some risk of potential adverse examination findings or other adverse regulatory actions based on a finding of unsafe, poor, and sound practice. So it's just something to keep in mind. Next, I wanted to turn to, next slide, Brian, please, to the, very briefly talk about the Federal Credit Reporting Act, or FCRA, which is another key federal statute in the privacy area. The FCRA sets standards for the collection, communication, and use of information bearing on a consumer credit worthiness. Under the statute, financial institutions that furnish information about consumers to consumer reporting agencies, or CRAs, must not furnish inaccurate information to CRAs, and must have reasonable policies and procedures to ensure the accuracy of information provided to CRAs. The FCRA also generally prohibits inter-affiliate sharing consumer information other than transactions and experience information without providing the customer with an opportunity to opt out. And the COVID-19 Crisis Relief Act, the CARES Act, amended the FCRA for the duration of the coronavirus emergency to generally require financial institutions that furnish information to CRAs, which are referred to as furnishers, to report the credit obligations or accounts as current, irrespective of agreed accommodation to defer or forbear on pending obligations. On this slide, we have also included a reference to the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, only because we get questions in the current context about its potential availability. The Act applies primarily to medical providers and administrators of healthcare plans, and generally should not apply to financial institutions. Moving over to the next slide, I wanted to talk briefly about COVID-19 federal regulatory guidance relevant to data protection and privacy. As most of you probably know, in early March, the federal banking regulatory agencies issued an updated interagency statement on pandemic planning, which, among other things, focuses on the need for risk monitoring and testing of the increased reliance on online banking, telephone banking, call center services, and of the institution's remote access and telecommuting capabilities. The guidance notes that during a pandemic, there may be a high reliance on employee telecommuting, which could put a strain on remote access capabilities such as capacity, bandwidth, and authentication mechanism. The guidance indicates that analysis of remote access capabilities, mapping of related technology infrastructure to employee needs during a pandemic, and considering internal and external capacity are necessary to help ensure telecommuting strategies will work during the pandemic. The guidance notes that incorporating the impact of pandemic risk into the institution's business continuity plan involves additional complexity since a typical disaster emergency response mechanisms and methods may not be feasible. And data breach incident response plans are one response mechanism that should be reevaluated in light of the pandemic impact. Guidance also states that institutions should evaluate the plans of critical service providers for operation during a pandemic, which would include data-related service providers. Also, the federal regulators have issued guidance regarding the risks of fraud and phishing that could lead to unauthorized access to data. FinCEN, the FDIC, and the CFPB have all issued guidance alerting institutions to increased risks of data breaches and attempts to steal personal information. So at the state level, we have the relatively recently implemented cybersecurity rules of the New York State Department of Financial Services, or the DFS, which require DFS-regulated entities that are covered entities, including branches and agencies of foreign banks regulated by the DFS, to adopt a cybersecurity program designed to ensure the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the covered entities' information system and non-public information. Non-public information under the DFS cyber rule is all electronic information that is not publicly available information and includes business-related information of a covered entity, the unauthorized disclosure of which would cause a material adverse impact on the business, operations, or security of the institution, as well as non-public personal information about individuals, such as social security numbers, driver license numbers, passwords, biometric records, etc. A particular reference to the current crisis environment, non-public information specifically covers information related to the physical health of any individual. The cybersecurity program required under the DFS rule must be designed to identify cyber risks, detect and respond to cybersecurity events, and recover from cybersecurity events, and must be based on the covered entity's risk assessment, which is the cornerstone of the DFS cyber rule. The risk assessment would necessarily change in the context of the work from home environment, and institutions should take steps to adjust their controls and response procedures to cybersecurity events to take into account the work from home environment. Based on its risk assessment, each covered entity must maintain systems and controls that include encryption to protect non-public information, include multi-factor authentication, limit user access privileges, and are designed to reconstruct material financial transactions, including through audit trail. Cybersecurity program for each covered entity must also provide for penetration testing, which should be developed taking into account the covered entity's risk assessment. And the rule also contains specific requirements for staff dedicated to cyber compliance and reporting lines to the entity's board of directors or equivalent governing body. DFS regulated institutions should ensure that they have adequate staffing dedicated to cyber compliance and that the reporting channels work effectively despite the work from home challenges. As part of its cybersecurity program, each covered entity must establish a written incident response plan designed to properly respond and recover from a cybersecurity event. The incident response plan must address, among other things, the internal processes for responding to a cybersecurity event. In light of the current environment, these internal processes and the incident response plans itself should be revisited to ensure that they're still effective. The DFS cyber rule also requires the implementation of written policies and procedures designed to ensure the security of any information systems and non-public information that can be accessed or is maintained by third-party service providers. These procedures should be based on a risk assessment of the third-party service provider, and the rule also requires the periodic assessment of third-party service providers on the risks they present. So in the current environment, the risk posed by third-party service providers should certainly be reassessed. In April, next slide. In April, the DFS issued COVID-related cybersecurity guidance, which highlights the increase in cybercrime during the pandemic and emphasizes that covered entities must comply with the requirements of the DFS cyber rule. The DFS guidance also specifically reminded covered entities that cybersecurity events must be reported within 72 hours and as promptly as possible. DFS also specifically highlighted that DFS-regulated institutions must assess specific risks as required under the cyber rule and must address such risks appropriately. The specific risks that the DFS flagged are in three categories. First, risks arising from working from home. Second, risks arising from phishing and fraud. And third, risks associated with third-party service providers. With respect to working from home, the DFS has highlighted that the remote work has created new security challenges and new vulnerabilities that may be exploited by attackers. And to mitigate these new risks and vulnerabilities, the DFS has emphasized that companies should take remote access, should make remote access as secure as possible under the circumstances. This includes use of multi-factor authentication and secure VPN connections that will encrypt all data in transit. New devices such as computers and phones used for remote working should be properly secured. The guidance also notes the expansion of bring your own device use and specifically cautions regarding the need to properly secure such devices. They also caution that video and audio conferencing applications that are used in the remote working environment are targeted and should be configured to prevent unauthorized access and make sure that institutions should make sure that employees are given guidance on how to use them security. The guidance also specifically instructs covered entities to remind their employees not to send not public information to personal emails, accounts, and devices. With respect to increase in phishing and fraud, the DFS has indicated that regulated entities should remind their employees to be alert for phishing and fraud emails and revisit phishing training and testing at the earliest practical opportunity. With respect to third-party service provider risk, the DFS has indicated that regulated entities should reassess the risk, critical vendors, and critical infrastructure to determine how they are adequately addressed in the current environment. Also wanted to very briefly go over a new statute that came into effect on March 22nd in New York called the New York Stop Hack and Improve Electronic Data Security Act, or the SHIELD Act. This generally requires any person or business that holds private information of a resident in New York to develop, implement, and maintain reasonable safeguards to protect the security, confidentiality, and integrity of such private information. The Act triggers notification requirements for unauthorized access to private information and contains data security requirements to prevent access to private information. The SHIELD Act contains an exemption from its private information safeguard requirements for entities that are subject to such requirements under, among other things, the GLBA or the DFS cyber rules. Entities that are subject to such requirements and defined under the Act as compliant regulated entities. So accordingly, New York offices of foreign banks should be deemed to be in compliance with the SHIELD Act, with its data security requirements, in particular if they comply with the DFS cyber rule or complying with GLBA data safeguard requirements. Nonetheless, we thought we should mention the SHIELD Act because it underscores the importance of implementing data security controls over non-public private data and the risk from unauthorized access to such data. Also, the requirements of the SHIELD Act potentially be relevant to non-bank affiliates of foreign banks in New York that are not subject to the BFS rule or the GLBA requirements. So with that, I'll turn it over to Brian to talk about the California Consumer Protection Act.
Thanks, Phil. So, a conversation about the legal framework for banks wouldn't be complete without talking about the California Consumer Privacy Act. And you probably have seen a lot about this in the news recently. The Attorney General recently issued regulations with guidance on the law, but there's questions about whether it will be enforced at the moment of enforcement. So just stepping back for a second, and we were just going to talk about this pretty briefly. So if an institution does business in California, you need to be aware of the CCPA, but it only applies to California resident data. So the law has been in effect as of the beginning of this year, but the California Attorney General, who was tasked with enforcing the law, won't begin enforcement until July 1st, 2020. So, that's in a couple of weeks. Everyone is really interested to see exactly what is going to happen once he is allowed to begin enforcing the law. So just briefly, what the CCPA does. So what it does is it provides companies, or it provides individuals with rights relating to their data. So it's almost like a GDPR type approach. GDPR is an EU regulation that applies to EU residents, and it came into effect a few years ago, and the California law sort of takes some guidance from that law. So it provides transparency rights. So you have to provide notice to California residents on what you're doing with their data, who you are sharing it with, and that sort of thing. It provides access rights. So a resident can ask for copies of the data that you have. Some deletion rights, although those are pretty limited with exceptions. The ability to opt out of having data sold to the extent that data is being sold. And the right to non-discrimination. So if they request or if they exercise their rights, they're not allowed to be discriminated against in terms of the level of service that's being provided or what is being charged. So we're not going to go too in-depth about this, but we just wanted to provide an overview. And the CCPA also does have a couple of other implications. Probably the most interesting of which is that it does expand protections and the right of remedy for data breaches. The one I think that has been getting the most interest is that if there is a breach that affects California residents because of a company's failure to implement reasonable security measures, the resident can actually sue for damages of up to $750 without showing any damages. So they don't actually have to prove that they've been harmed, although obviously there are constitutional standing issues and things like that, but they don't actually have to demonstrate that they have gotten harmed in any dollar amount. They are automatically provided a remedy of up to $750. And you can imagine, given breaches that they often involve tens of thousands, maybe even millions of individuals, so this number can get pretty big pretty quickly. We did get a question about the scope of California residents. So the law does not define resident, it just sort of refers to resident elsewhere. So what a resident, what the definition of a California resident is based on other places where it's defined. And it's just a sort of traditional definition, which is, you are in the state with an intention to stay, or with no intention, or rather no intention of leaving. So if you're just going there for a year, but you're intending to come back, you're there on a secondment, you're there visiting family, that wouldn't count. So we mentioned that the CCPA is going to be in effect, or has been in effect since the beginning of the year, and it will be enforced in a couple of weeks. There's been some interesting background here. So the Attorney General issued final rules on the implementation of the law on June 1st. And now it has to go through an administrative process. And because of COVID-19, the California governor actually provided a little bit of extension, as many governments have done, to their agencies in terms of reviewing regulations. And so while the Attorney General has asked that the regulations be expedited, it's not clear whether that's actually going to happen. And so far, we haven't gotten any indication that the regulations will be actually effective on July 1st. So they're going to be, it's kind of interesting because we're going to be in a weird position where the Attorney General can enforce a statute, but it can't actually enforce regulations that he thought were important to interpret the statute. So July is just really going to be a really interesting thing. Nevertheless, even though industry groups and people who are about to be regulated have asked, look, this is a crazy time, and there's still so much unclarity, we think you should push back enforcement. The Attorney General has repeatedly emphasized that actually in the time of this pandemic, privacy rights and data security are even more important than ever. And in fact, the Attorney General has issued guidance to consumers about the CCPA providing tips to consumers on how to protect their privacy and what their rights are. And just before I leave this, we did get a question about to what extent the law applies to individuals representing their company in a corporate function. And I didn't mention that, but there are two major exceptions to this, to the CCPA. The first is that the employee data is carved out of most of the statute. So rights of access, rights of deletion, that sort of thing does not apply to data collected from employees in the scope of their employment. Obviously, this was done because there creates some really tricky human resources issues with being able to access your personnel files and that sort of thing. And so while the legislature works on a compromise and a more limited scope of the rights applying to these this type of data, they have temporarily just exempted it from these rights. That is supposed to sunset at the end of this year, and so next year the rights do apply to employee data, and so this is something everyone's watching really closely, and we're hopeful that the legislature will get something done, or at least further extend the exemption. And then the second exemption addresses the question which we received, which is, what about individuals representing their company in a corporate function? There is an exception for information that's collected that reflects a transaction or something that's like an interaction between businesses. So if you are, a sales representative on behalf of a company and reaching out to another company's, vice president of procurement or whatever, and you collect personal information in that context, it will not be, the rights will not apply to that information. It's under the same sunset, so it will, that exemption lasts until the end of the year. And then if nothing changes, then next year, the rights will apply in that context. But we are also hopeful that there will be additional guidance and an updated sort of like more specific statute that addresses that. And I see I'm getting more
Brian,
questions.
Yeah, we got one more question on an AML one that I can take real quick. Sure. So does the exemption mean personal data such as passports that need to be kept for AML compliance reasons can be retained and a request to delete can be rejected? And the answer for that is generally yes, because if you're collecting it for other regulatory purposes, and you have, for instance, 5-year retention period, those types of requests for identification verification information that's going to be collected part of personal data, that you do not need to delete them in response to a CCPA request. Sorry, go ahead, Brian.
Thanks. All right, great. So we're going to spend a little bit of time now just talking about some of the increased risk factors that have arisen because of COVID-19. So this, these are just sort of some of the things that we've seen, some of the things that have been shared in the industry, just talking about what the key vulnerabilities are, like what are people seeing, and what do people need to focus on. And I think that's the key here is that, data privacy and cybersecurity, this is something that applies across your company, and you just need to really focus on where the most vulnerabilities are. And so here we've listed some of these key risk factors. So first one is boredom. Everyone's sitting behind the screen and all day, and that actually means more opportunities for attacks because some employees are very busy, but others aren't. And in any case, this is a very difficult time. And so we have people who are really craving an escape and more likely to be diverted to for example, a phishing attack. At the same time, there's also this sort of craving for information and like there's a lot more things that people are worried about. And so there are more avenues of attack available to, for example, someone who's trying to phish information. And so that's something to be aware of. Information overload is related to that. So everyone's being bombarded by information about COVID-19. Everyone's being bombarded with information about like school closures and reopenings and city closures and reopenings and that sort of thing. And so as a result, employees we're finding are not as focused as they normally would be on things like making sure that they maintain the confidentiality of client data. And so, and just as with boredom, there are more sort of opportunities for attack. Now, phishers can pretend to be from the CDC. They can pretend to be from local health officials. And normally, I think an employee would probably ignore those, but here, now, they're much more interested and focused on that type of thing, which opens up avenues for attack. At the same time, having to transition to work from home while potentially even maintaining a partially functioning office has really strained resources. And then all of a sudden, you potentially have a lot more personal devices being added to a network. And so, we're seeing that IT and security resources are really being strained, which obviously makes things makes them more likely for a hacker to gain access. And then with the personal devices, there's also use of home networks, or even occasionally, we've heard about people, like more people are trying to escape. We all live in New York City. Sometimes our living situation isn't particularly conducive to having multiple people work whilst children are, attending school, and so they go and they access a communal spaces network, but those are not configured for security, and so that increases the risk. And just generally, like, just systems are just overloaded by the increased strain placed on the available resources. And so that's something to watch for. I think Phil mentioned earlier on that, during one of the things that's particularly challenging right now is onboarding and offboarding. So new employees, they don't have the ability to get real full training on security protocols, and they're not used to it. And they're also facing the same issues that everyone else is facing with information overload and stress about everything else. And so they're more likely to be duped by phishing attacks and that sort of thing. And they're also being targeted. And then at the same time, similarly, people who are leaving, it's more difficult to offboard employees successfully. And it's easier to potentially attack their devices that are sort of in limbo. And an employee who's leaving is not necessarily focusing as much attention on, making sure that they properly lock down all of their information before they exit their job. And then obviously, there's like the fact we've done, and everyone has been great about, doing Zoom meetings and this type of thing, but it's just not the same as being in an office where you can, people can just like, pop down the hallway and just talk with a colleague. And so, if you get an email, and we'll talk about, spear phishing, but if you get an email that would raise eyebrows normally, now, in the past, you could just like go down the hallway and say like, hey, let's talk about this request for like a $50 million wire transfer. But now it's maybe like more likely that emails like that will be responded to, because that is just the way communications are working now. And then finally, there's this rush to deploy, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later as well. But the transition happened very quickly, and there was pressure to deploy new technologies as quickly as possible. And so there was less time for stress testing, less time to make sure that security protocols were put in place rigorously. And then there was, once it was deployed, it's more difficult to test and to go back and overlay. And so actually, an IAP survey, which is the International Association of Privacy Professionals, they found that almost 60% of privacy professionals who were surveyed said that their company had expedited or skipped and bypassed a privacy security measure altogether when they deployed new work from home protocols or new technology. And that's, and this is like people who have actually admitted to doing so. It just shows that people are moving really quickly, and and so now there might be vulnerabilities as a result of that. So we'll talk a little bit about some specific threats, and I actually think what we're going to do is we had a few polling questions available for this, but I think what we're actually going to do is we're going to skip those just for the sake of time. So, and I'm just going to move directly to those. So one of the things that we are all, I think people on this call are more likely to be aware of vulnerabilities and aware of, you're not supposed to click on links that look suspicious. I think we think that, yeah, there's no way that, our employees will be duped by a phishing test. But, I was pretty surprised when I found this statistic, but KnowBe4, which is a company that does phishing training, they found that prior to doing their training, almost 40% of employees, 37.9%, failed a phishing test before they underwent training. Now, obviously, we don't know if this is potentially a little bit increased just because they're trying to sell the product. But I also think that what it shows is that it is not as unlikely as we think. Phishing tests or phishing scams have become much more sophisticated than they were in the past. We're no longer facing those emails full of typos and formatting errors. They're now, really slick, and it's very difficult to tell the difference between a legitimate email and an illegitimate email. And notably, after training, failures dropped from 37.9% to 14.1%. And this is from KnowBe4, but Google, which doesn't really have an interest in scaring people about phishing or anything like that, they have reported recently that phishing attacks generally are up by over 350% in recent months. And this is just based on their tracking of phishing websites, so websites that are designed specifically for the purpose of trying to steal user data. And this is because COVID-19 is an area of interest, and there are a lot more avenues of attack available to them. So just talking briefly about phishing, I mean, we all know sort of what this is, but the classic example of a phishing is like a screenshot here where you send an email impersonating a legitimate source, and you ask the user to click a link to say, they actually might even pretend to identify a security vulnerability and say, your security has been compromised. We need you to update your password. So please go to this website, which is designed to look like a legitimate website, and enter your credentials so that we can change your passwords. And so if you're not careful, you can be duped by that. And so it's important to notify and make sure that your employees are aware, and don't be, and especially we talked earlier about onboarding new employees. If they don't assume that they've had this training before, and make sure that you train them effectively. And this is not just with emails. There are now voice calls aimed at phishing. There's SMS aimed at phishing. And what we're seeing is that all the guidance that Phil and I had mentioned earlier, everyone is identifying that COVID-19 has just really spiked the amount of phishing that has happened, and it's something that individuals need to worry about.
Hey, Brian, let's skip ahead to slide 25 just for timing.
Yep. Sure.
Okay. So we wanted to talk just for a couple minutes about how to respond to, I know a lot of people have already probably learned a lot about data breach responses, but how to respond to a data breach. And there's just a few things that we really wanted to focus on with this. The first is, of course, something that probably everybody on this line is doing, which is preemption and preparedness. So some things that Brian mentioned regarding phishing have been some of the largest issues that we've seen. And we just mentioned this because I'm sure if some of you have worked in this, if you have one employee that has their email account breached, you can have very large email accounts. And the biggest issue that we've seen in terms of expense with a cybersecurity breach is unstructured data in email accounts. So, downloading of data for various compliance reasons in an email account that is phished, and then how to identify what that data is, and then to provide proper notifications within that. So having the right preemption and preparedness is very important. In the current working from home environment, this is even more important because as Brian also mentioned, you have employees that are being onboarded remotely. And in some cases, that means they may not have company or firm or bank computers. So you may have downloaded some software so that they can start to work remotely while they were onboarded, even though you haven't been in the office. Bring your own devices also fall into that type of a category, be that mobile or other devices. And then unfortunately, because we're in this environment and some businesses have had to let people go, we also have the offboarding issue with that, right? So how do you collect your equipment? How do you ensure that there hasn't been data downloaded into home equipment, and to look at those types of policies to make sure that they're in place and that if something happens, you're kind of well covered within that. We can definitely say that that's become a real increased issue as we've all moved to a working from home environment and where people aren't in the office to do the normal onboarding and offboarding type of procedures and to be put on more firm related equipment. Within that, just to mention, obviously there's huge notification obligations. We've already talked about, of course, the DFS 72-hour requirement for notification. Obviously, there's tons of state law requirements, international requirements. These are just things to make sure you know where your data is collected so you can respond very quickly if and when you have a data breach. And then, of course, there's remediation. These are all pretty common things to discuss. So next slide, please. Ransomware has become of increased importance recently. Looks like we have a poll up. Do you have a firm policy on whether to pay in the event of a ransomware attack? Just give a few seconds for that one. Yes, no, or not sure. Oh, okay, so most of them are not sure, which is pretty common, and some will, it seems like some do have a policy, some don't. We can, of course, the number one thing with ransomware is to make sure that you have some backups of your data so that you can continue to operate, even if you do have a ransomware attack. Wanted to just go on quickly to the next slide, which is just some preventions and key takeaways. So just to cover these off pretty quickly, we want you to make sure you're obviously training, testing, and risk alerts, security controls. Vendor risk analysis is of increased importance during this time because any issue that you're having within your financial institution, your vendors are also having. So all these things that we've talked about are also occurring with the vendors. And so, this may be a time to consider discussing what their protocols are in terms of their working from home environment, given that this is likely to continue for a relatively long period of time. response protocols and disaster recoveries. This backs off of what we were talking about in terms of ransomware, and also increased attention on risk areas. This is once again just what we were talking about, that onboarding and offboarding. I mean, we just noticed it because we have heard a lot of data breaches involved in that, where they'll open up a VPN network to your company, and then also have a separate window open, and sometimes there's some issues associated with that. We did get a question on how common it is and useful it is to have cyber insurance. The answer is it's becoming more and more common from what we see. And in terms of the usefulness, I can definitely say that you should read your insurance policy very closely, because the insurers are pretty savvy as to what they will and will not cover. And we have often seen insurance scoped more narrowly than it becomes useful in the end. You want to see if you're going to, what kind of providers they're going to allow you to choose in terms of responding quickly, and also to make sure that, for instance, one of the bigger issues that we see is whether or not they're going to cover your vendors and your third parties, and how closely those things are going to be covered, because oftentimes there ends up being issues regarding who's responsible for some of the cybersecurity issues and whether or not insurance is going to cover that. So, I would say that it's becoming much more common, and a lot of financial institutions are taking it on. It is expensive, but it can be useful. That being said, read it closely and really think of whether it's going to fit your needs, because you don't want to end up paying for something that you can't use in the future. All right. I think we just have a couple minutes left, so let's just flip to the next slide. Just some considerations for when returning to the office. Just think about that. Just kind of think of some good hygiene things. We did receive a question about collection of employee health data. This really goes to notification requirements of your employees. So one of the things you may want to look at if you're doing some testing, so they're coming into the office, you're required to take their temperature, you're required to take information regarding whether they've had any symptoms, etc. Very important to take a look at your when we say notification requirements, typically a lot of companies will have notices that go into their employees that say, we collect information about your financial background, we do background checks, all of that type of things. Typically, you wouldn't be collecting a ton of health information about that, but now we are collecting health information. So see if your employee notifications are covering that, and then see how it's covering how you're going to use that information. And that type of information isn't really coming under HIPAA for you, but it is certainly sensitive information. So it's something that you should have a policy regarding. You should have notification and consider consent requirements. That being said, given the current situation, it's something that, will be collected, will be permitted to be collected. But, if that type of information is also then has a security breach associated with it, that becomes another issue for you. So I would say look very closely at what your notification requirements are, because typically they would not include that type of data that you would have been collected previously that you're not going to be collecting. Next slide. So just never let a serious crisis go to waste. And I think we're just about at the end. So with that, I don't think we have any further questions, but if we do, if anybody wants to type another one, we're happy to answer it. And otherwise, we'll thank you very much for your time and for joining us today.
Well, this is Bridget. I want to thank you, Megan, Phil, and Brian. This was very helpful. And, as your presentation shows, each layer of this reveals yet another layer of questions and issues, and we really appreciate you helping us walk through those. So I hope everyone has a good afternoon and weekend. Thank you all again for joining us, and reminder that the recorded session and the slides will go out to all of you via email. And with that, we'll close out the 5th of our COVID series. Thank you.